Okay, in the next two videos, we're going to be looking at what is meant by this field of behavioural economics, what are the insights behavioural economists have made into human behaviour, and what are some of the assumptions they make of human behaviour. So, behavioural economics is a new field of study, and basically what it's trying to incorporate the insights of psychology into economics. So, get an idea of how consumers actually behave and link that to the choices people make with their preferences and their decision making. So behavioural economists use experiments to look at how consumers behave. They try and make things as realistic as possible, so they will often use financial rewards to get an idea of how humans actually behave. Rather than just assuming a theoretical model of human behaviour, they want to see how humans actually behave in real life or in real circumstances. So, in terms of some of the insights of behavioural economists, they believe that individuals are not always seeking to maximise their own personal benefits. So sometimes we act in the interest of others, sometimes consumers are not self-interested, but they care about fairness. We're not always rational, so we don't always sum up all the costs and benefits of a decision and make rational decisions. We're not always looking to minimise the pain of decisions. We don't always possess adequate knowledge, so we make quick-fire decisions. We satisfy and use the best available information we have. We're not always capable of weighing up all the possibilities. Sometimes we only consider the short term, or we value the short term too highly. Sometimes our decisions are too heavily based on psychological or emotional factors, so we can be influenced by our feelings and emotions at a certain point in time. So behavioural economists have essentially summarised all their insights into three main theories that contradict some of the assumptions of traditional economists. So traditional economists believe we have complete rationality, complete willpower, and we act in our own self-interest, where behavioural economists say that we have bounded rationality or limited rationality, limited willpower, and limited self-interest. So basically on the left-hand side we've got how an econ would behave, and on the right-hand side describes how behavioural economists see human behaviour. So you can see here that econs believe that we carefully weigh up all the costs and benefits before making decisions, where humans believe that sometimes we make quick judgments, or we just have heuristics and we rely on sort of rules of thumb or past experiences. We're not subjective to cognitive biases. Sometimes we fall into traps when we make decisions, like things like the anchoring bias. Sometimes we weigh losses greater than gains as opposed to evenly weighing up the costs and benefits of decisions. Sometimes we act based on our default settings, which we'll talk about. Sometimes we have self-control problems and are subject to the present bias. And sometimes we allow emotional factors to influence our decision, not just purely the costs and benefits. So the first two are what we call bounded willpower and bounded self-interest. So bounded willpower means that consumers don't always possess complete self-control about their decisions, about their choices. So sometimes they will succumb to certain appetites or urges, which may be based on their emotions at that point in time, rather than making a purely rational decision. And that can lead them to regretting decisions later on as well. So, for example, one example is the present bias, where people might overvalue the current in favour of the future. And therefore they do things that they get value out of now, or they get utility out of now, and then they regret in the future. So, for example, overeating, spending on credit, problem gambling, taking illicit drugs, they can all be examples of what we call bounded willpower. The present bias is the tendency to overvalue immediate rewards at the expense of our long-term gain. So sometimes we fall victim to the present bias, where we value our current more than the future. So a good example would be the government tries to stop the present bias by saying that there's compulsory superannuation, with the intention that consumers will save more for the future, or individuals, because they're forcing them to pay 9.25% of their income into retirement. A traditional economist would say this is not very necessary because people will save the right amount anyway. So by forcing them to save, the government is trying to address the problems of the present bias and bounded willpower. Bounded self-interest is this idea that consumers also care about fairness. We're not just acting in our own self-interest, or to maximise our own personal benefit. So that game we played with the idea of the fairness game, where I gave all the money to one person that cleaned the car, and they had to choose whether they would share it, and the other person could reject their decision. That was an example of bounded self-interest. If we were purely acting in our own self-interest, you would take whatever money you received, because it's better than getting none, which you would get in the other circumstances. So consumers are also driven by a sense of fairness and will reject proposals that they believe treat them unfairly, even if it's in their own self-interest to accept that deal. And the last one is bounded rationality. And we'll talk about the factors that fit into bounded rationality in the next video. But consumers' ability to make rational decisions is compromised by the availability of information. Sometimes they don't possess complete information about products. Sometimes the decision making is complex. And they also suffer from cognitive limitations and time constraints as well when making decisions. So sometimes humans will will resort to heuristics or mental shortcuts when making decisions. So some key terms you need to be aware of in relation to bounded rationality. Heuristics refers to the cognitive shortcuts, or sometimes we just have rules of thumb, which basically means we just do the same things that we did in the past, even though they may not be the rational thing to do. These are referred to as heuristics, and they can cause errors in decision making. So rules of thumb are just broadly accurate or guiding principles that make us act in a particular way. Sometimes people will satisfy us where we might settle for an option that's good enough, but not necessarily the best outcome. So for example, when we're buying our lunch, we might just satisfy us and buy something that's quick and easy, even if it's not the rational decision in that case. Bounded rationality has a whole range of different things within it. So these are all different cognitive biases that impact our decision making. The present bias is an example of bounded willpower, but all of these other factors, which we'll talk about in the next video, are examples of bounded rationality. Factors that limit our ability to act rationally in a certain circumstance. Okay, and some examples are the overconfidence bias, vividness, status quo, anchoring, herd behavior, and framing. They are the 6 main ones you need to be aware of, and we'll talk about each of these in the next video. Thank you.